Justin. Good morning. What I'm going to be talking about builds up really well on what Spencer was talking about earlier. Oh, it's me. We got a hum going. Oh well, we'll talk through it. It'll be the soundtrack for my sermon. What Spencer talked about, the importance of running the race, in order to glorify God and do the best with our own lives, starts with a simple question, and I'd like to start the question: what is vision? Vision it's something that can mean a lot of different things. The word has a lot of different meanings. I could say, well, I'm able to see everybody. I can see the pews and the walls and the ceiling. I got some vision. But that's not really what we're talking about. So, if I'm not talking about that kind of vision, the next logical question I know everybody is asking is, am I talking about the vision from Marvel's The Avengers? He's coming up here. The vision from The Avengers. There he is. So the vision from the Avengers, aside from being a really cool android, he has the ability to fly. He can actually change his mass and his density to float or sink. He can phase through walls and doors. He can actually travel through time. He can shoot microwave beams out of his forehead jewel. I mean, wouldn't everybody want those kind of powers? The vision has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But I'm a comic book geek, and I couldn't talk about vision without mentioning the vision. So let me ask the question again. What is vision? Specifically, the type of vision I'm talking about is identifying, God's plan or purpose for our life, the race that we're to run, like Spencer talked about. And what I'd like to start with is let's look at some scripture. Now, it'll be up on the screen, but if you want to look in your Pew Bibles, you can as well. But we're looking at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. In it, King Solomon writes, he says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." So it's a shorter verse today, but it's a pretty powerful saying. What King Solomon's trying to tell us is that while we're on this journey called life in this world, if we find a way to live as God would have us live, we're going to have a much straighter path, an easier race to run. Those lights are already going to be lit up for us as we're running down the path. The more we stray away from it, the implication is, in all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your path straight. If you don't submit to him, who knows what the future will bring. Now, you look in Scripture, and you will find an abundant example of men and women who embraced the vision that God had for them, who ran the race like Paul, like King David, Moses. You look at all these examples of men and women who were able to run the race that God had laid out for them. And of course, the most perfect example of that being Jesus Christ. I mean, he walked the path without error. Every single step was perfect. And we see what kind of difference he made in the world. So the logical question is, how do we pursue God's vision for our life? And I'm going to break this down to just 3 different topics, and it's definitely much broader than that. But I'll just kind of talk about them. We'll go back and go through each one individually. So firstly, we identify God's vision for our life. How are you going to run the race if you don't know what race you're going to run? Secondly, we prepare for the vision on God's time, not our time, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. And thirdly, we embrace and live out the vision. Pretty straightforward. We identify it, we get ready for it, and we do it. So there's a lot to talk about along the way. So again, how do we pursue God's vision for our life? We identify God's vision for our life. Now there's 3 qualifiers I'd like to throw up. Identifying God's vision for our life is a pretty critical step. If you start running the wrong race, you get in the wrong lane, you're not going to finish the way you're supposed to. And so I'm going to throw up 3 things that I'd like to talk about. One is that God's vision for our life, it will begin as a concern and will become a must, and I'll talk about that in a second. That all visions begin as an idea, but not all good ideas are visions. And third is pray. So, There is, in the Bible, you can see examples of how when God was communicating a vision to somebody, he came in a powerful way, in a cloud, in fire, in a burning bush, and talking donkeys. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of how God worked in miraculous ways to tell people, dude, you're on the wrong path, or this is the way you're supposed to be going. Most of us don't have the privilege of talking to donkeys, at least not in a sane way. So, more the way that God works when he is communicating a vision to you is that you'll start to find that there's a concern that's laid on your heart or your mind. It's something that, just inside of you and you alone, that God has this beautiful picture of what this vision, this path that you're going to run, and he plants the seed. It's going to start as a concern. It's going to grow from that concern into something that you have to do something about. It's not something that you can really live with just ignoring. It becomes something where, I'd feel disobedient if I didn't do this thing that is laid on my heart. So number one is that vision. God will plant that seed, and he will put it on your heart. It's not something that I'm going to come up and say, hey, Tom, you're going to be a great street sweeper tomorrow. God's vision is that. And it's like, Tom would say, well, what? I don't think so. It's not in me. So God's going to plant it inside of your heart, which way to grow. Secondly, is that we have to weigh those concerns. Like it says, all visions begin as an idea, but not all good ideas are visions. All we have to do is watch TV for a few hours. We get on the internet, Facebook, and you will be bombarded with good ideas. Groups to help, people to help, things to do, places to see, all these great ideas that require time and energy to focus on and try to actually embrace, to chase down. And the reality is, if we focused on all these good ideas, we'd get nothing done in our lives. We would make no big impact in any area because we'd be diverting our energy everywhere. So it's important that even though it might be a concern that gets laid on our heart, that we weigh it, whether it's a good idea or whether it's really a way that God is pulling us, which then takes us to the third point, which is the most critical in identifying God's vision for your life, which is to pray, pray, and pray. Now this is a straightforward solution that, hey, if it's God's vision for our life, we should spend time in prayer. But reality is sometimes people overlook that step. We decide that this is the right way to go. It's logical. And so we pursue it without actually stopping to ask God, hey, is this the way I'm supposed to be going? And God will speak to you. He will take those concerns and he will peel away the ones that aren't supposed to be there. And he will highlight to you which direction you should be going. The vision that he has for you and you alone to make in this world, to make changes in this world and your families. And so actually in regards to this prayer of spending the time and weighing the things that God is doing in us, Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 2, verse 13. He says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." God's saying that God is the one, or Paul is saying that God is the one that is actually inside changing it. It makes sense. He's planted that seed. And the more time that we can spend in prayer, weighing those concerns and those good ideas against God's will, it's going to highlight the direction that we need to go, the race that we need to run. So we've now identified, God's vision for our life. So how do we pursue the vision in our life? We identified it. Secondly, we prepare for the vision on God's time. Now, I've got two important points I'm going to list and we'll talk about. Is firstly, don't rush. Be patient. And secondly, is allow God to guide and teach you during this time. I have an exaggerated example of, say I go to sleep tonight. I wake up tomorrow and I decide, God's calling me to be a brain surgeon. I'm gonna change the life of hundreds, if not thousands of people through my ability to open up and fix their brains. And I decide it's time to do something about this. I go down to Walmart or Meijer. I get the really nice X-Acto knives, and I pick up some sheets and some gauze. I go back home. I put a sign on my door and I say, I'm open for business. We're going to start helping people one person at a time. And the reality of that situation is, who in their right mind would trust somebody who bought some X-Acto knives from Meijer to fix their brains? It's not going to happen. The reality is that when God calls us to a vision, it is rarely ever immediate. And that is a big struggle for a lot of us. You have to be able to be patient. God has to shape you and prepare you for that path, that vision that he has for your life. And so this is sometimes one of the most difficult steps, is that we, especially in our society, we want to get things done. We want to move, we want to achieve, let's move on to the next obstacle. And the reality is, God says, nope, slow down. Let me mold you, let me shape you into being the person that you have to be to do this vision, to make the biggest impact in this world that I laid out for you from the time I created the universe. So again, actually Paul has a great example of this, and it's kind of a graphic visual that he gives, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 26 through 27, he says, "Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and I make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." You know, Paul's vision, he was one of those fortunate enough where Jesus spoke to him directly in a vision, actually talked to him and told him, "Paul, I'm sending you to preach the good news to the Gentiles." And so Paul understood with every fiber of his being, he had to change himself. He had to become all things to all people, and he had to peel away all the selfishness, the things that were not godly, and he would beat himself. He would beat his mind. He would beat his spirit. He would beat his heart into submission so that all of his thoughts, all of his feelings were obedient to God. So that as he walked this path, ran this race that God had set before him, he would make the biggest impact. He would bring the most amount of people to God through chasing down this vision that God had for his life. So, we've now identified and prepared for the vision. So how do we pursue God's vision? Lastly is, of course, we embrace and live out the vision. It makes sense. You know, we've identified where God's drawing us. We prepared for it. We're ready for it. Now let's get it done. And oddly enough, this stage here, although it seems the simplest, has produced the most amount of difficulty for me personally. You know, I was in a very fortunate situation that at a very young age, God made it clear that a vision he had for my life was to operate a business. And I came from a very unique family business background and had, at the right time, right place, God had set it up so I was able to buy the business I was working at in 2012. And we had 22 employees, and what I could say is 10 months ago, I was the CEO. We had over $10 million in sales. The books looked great. And what I can say today is I'm the only person left with the business. All 22 people had to be dismissed, and it was because of bad decisions. And I don't say that as a woe is me. You know, I accept responsibility for the bad decisions I made, and I could throw stones at things that happened along the way. But in the end, it was just me. But what I can say, and there's a silver lining to the cloud, is that what I found during that process is I had decided, God's vision for me is to own a business. And I owned a business. And that business was the vision. And when that business started tumbling way outside of my control, despite all my effort to try to save it, and it failed, I considered myself a failure. I said, well, God, you gave me this beautiful opportunity to make a difference for my employees, for my vendors, my customers. I screwed it up. And it's gone. And what happens, I think that's kind of something similar that a lot of us struggle with. We as humans, we look to those things that we can hold on to, that we can grab hold of, and we say, this is the purpose, this is the vision that I'm chasing after. And what God did through that process is he said, no. He said, Ben, my vision for you is the same today as it was yesterday. He said, stop looking at your surroundings and focus on me. Keep focused on me and run the race that I have set before you. Don't worry about the circumstances and the situation you're in. And what I can say is today, I'm now CEO at a totally new business that has an awesome facility, much better atmosphere, and it is a joy going to work every day. And I never would have envisioned that this was possible through the issues that are going through with the old business. It'll take a long time for that to sort out. But I fixed my eyes back on the prize. And so what I want to stress is that once you start living out your vision, is never forget that God's vision is for you alone, and not the situation you are in. God's vision is for you. It is not for a business that you work at. God's vision is for you. It is not for a position that you hold or something that you're able to do. God's vision is for you. It is not based in or grounded in a relationship that you're in. God's vision is to you. His promise is to you. And all he asks is if you focus on him and you run the race that he has laid out before you, you will bless others and you will make a difference in this world that none of us can imagine. The Bible is full of examples of the changes that people brought about by pursuing the race, running the race that God laid out for them. So I wish I could say I came up with a lot of this stuff on my own, but I plagiarized a lot of it from a book. It's called Visioneering by Andy Stanley. I highly recommend it to anybody who's considering, how is God pushing you or leading you in your life. There it is. It's got tremendous worksheets at the end of every chapter, and you spend prayerful time trying to focus on how is God speaking and leading me in a given direction. So, in summary, we talked about how do we pursue God's vision for our life. And number one, we identified the vision for our life, God's vision. 2, we prepared for the vision on God's time, not our time. And thirdly, we embraced and lived out the vision. And, in the Bible, you can see examples of how an individual who was pursuing this vision made a difference to a city or a family or a country. What would it look like if we did that? What if this church embraced that? What if the city embraced it? It is clear that with a single individual, huge changes can happen. And the more time that we spend pursuing the path that God has laid out for us, the straight path that God has laid out for us, the bigger impact we're going to make for this kingdom and to the people around us. So I invite you to pray. I'd like to invite the ushers to come forward for the morning